Hello, everyone. If you're tuning in for the first time tonight, welcome to Orchidfest 2021 Wild Discoveries. If you've tuned in for the last two nights, welcome back. This is our final evening of presentations, and I would like to extend many thanks to the Friends of the Bruce District Parks Association, who, with the assistance of Parks Canada, have facilitated this event so we can immerse ourselves in the beauty of the Bruce Peninsula and learn more about our role in preserving that beauty. We're here today on the traditional territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, comprised of two communities, Saugeen First Nation and the Chippewas of Nawash, who have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. I encourage everyone to educate yourselves further about the land you live on and suggest consulting nativeland.ca to learn more about the Indigenous territories, Indigenous languages, and treaties of the place you call home. Over the past two evenings, we've been lucky enough to have Brian Popelier, Tyler Miller, Audrey Armstrong, and Megan Bonifant share their experience and expertise with us. Tonight, we'll be learning from Peter Raspberry during his presentation about technical tips for successful and ethical wildflower photography, and Parks Canada staff Madeline Sanigan, Sean Skinkle, and Zach Root as they take us on a virtual guided hike showcasing the many pollinators of orchids and show us how to become citizen scientists using the iNaturalist app. If you have any questions for the presenters during their presentations, I encourage you to ask them using the Q&A function that can be accessed at the bottom of this screen. Zach will highlight questions to be answered live at the end of the presentation and facilitate the live Q&A session again this evening. We will break for 5 minutes between presentations to allow the next presenter to set up. I think we're ready to begin. Peter Raspberry is retired following a 38-year career in outdoor and environmental education. As a hobby photographer, he is excited to share his deep connection to nature through some of his images and experiences. Peter's photographs have appeared in Canadian Wildlife Federation's Canadian Wildlife and Children's Wild magazines. They have also been on exhibit at the Environment Canada's Biosphere Museum in Montreal for the United Nations International Year of Biodiversity. Welcome, Peter.
Great. Thank you very much. And I can share my screen. Very good. Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. I've attended each of the last 4 sessions and they've been excellent, and I really appreciate all of the knowledge and expertise that people have shared and their passion for what they do. Tonight, I describe myself as a hobby photographer. I'm not a professional photographer. Or an instructor of photographer, but I've had, I think, some measure of success personally, and I'm happy to share that with you tonight. I would also like to thank all of the people listed here from both Friends of the Bruce District Parks Association and Parks Canada, and there may be some others working in the background whose names aren't on there, but certainly appreciate all that everybody has done. I had hoped to be sitting out on the deck doing this tonight, but I was a little concerned about background noises and distractions, so I wimped out and moved inside. So I'm going to start a little bit. My biggest concern about tonight was having way more than I would have time to talk about. So, and that's probably still the case. So I'm going to jump right into it. The part about ethical photography, I'm not going to preach, but I did facilitate a couple of workshops on photography at past festivals, orchid festivals. And it was just such a huge concern taking out a group of 5 or 6 people, and maybe there was only one individual of a certain kind of flower, and everybody wants to get down on the ground and photograph that flower. And, you know, we can have such a huge impact out there, walking around, putting our camera bags down, lying on the ground, all of those sorts of things. As somebody said the other night, I'm sure we're preaching to the choir here, but it's just so important, particularly with such sensitive flowers and environments, to be as careful as we can. So number one, I certainly recommend dressing for comfort and protection. I usually go out in both long sleeves and long pants. If there's something in particular that you're looking for to photograph, research the local parks or talk to park naturalists and find out what's there. Certainly a lot of our communities have great natural areas. Use apps like iNaturalist to locate things and some of the atlases that are out there as well. Certainly don't trespass on private property. That can get you in trouble and the rest of us as photographers in trouble as well. But sometimes asking for permission will gain us access to some of those kinds of places. And where necessary, stay on trails and boardwalks. I know that Brian talked about that the other night at Bruce Trail Properties, to please stay on the trails. And in photographing, sometimes there's a distracting element, a blade of grass or a twig or something that you don't want in there. Please be awfully careful about not removing other plants and being very careful of all of the things that we're surrounded by. And certainly don't pick any plants that are out there. I'll have something to say about that a little further on as well. Be aware of things surrounding us that could be risks. Poison ivy, biting insects, ticks are a growing concern. And here on the Bruce, potentially venomous snakes. Be aware of all of what is surrounding us and be careful of your own physical presence. We're often kneeling on the ground or lying down on the ground. And just be considerate and respectful of the environment. In terms of technical things, again, I'm not an expert, but I do my best to try to learn what my camera has to offer. So number one, I think, is to learn about your camera, what it has to offer. And the camera manual would be the first place to start. Go through your camera menu and look at all the things that are there. You'll probably find something and say, wow, I didn't know it could do that, or gee, that's how I do that. There's lots of other books as well and online tutorials. I use some books written by a guy named Tom Hogan, who writes about Nikon camera bodies, and he describes them as the manuals that Nikon should have written, and they're really quite excellent. So I've had 3 of them for different camera bodies that I've had. In understanding photography, there's all kinds of versions of this, lots of stuff that you can find online, but exposure of a photograph comes down to 3 different things: the ISO, or the sensitivity of the sensor or the film to light, to the shutter speed that we use, and to the aperture that we use. So down on the bottom for ISO, you can see that low ISOs like 100 or 200 have very clean, crisp, will produce clean, crisp images. The higher the ISO, the more grain or digital noise we get in the photo. So that one's jumped right up to 12,800 there at the end, which I've never shot. Shutter speed, of course, a fast shutter speed like 1/1000th of a second will freeze action in the frame, and a slow one like 1/8 of a second will create blur, and blur can be a desirable thing in a photograph as well. And then using our f-stops, our apertures, your camera is always focusing at its largest aperture. So in this case, it's f1.4. So it's using the most light to focus. But when you press the shutter button, it'll physically close it down to the f-stop that you've chosen. So you can see that numbers like f2 and 2.8 are fairly large openings and let in a lot of light. But a limited depth of field in focus, and f-stops like f8 and 11, which are smaller openings, let in less light, but create a greater amount of depth of field. Once you get past f16 into things like f22, you're also getting into something called diffraction, which softens your photos a little bit. So there's some limitations in there. Consider flowering dates. If you know that there's something that you want to photograph, when does it come into flower? And use that as a guideline to get out. What time of day is the best day to get out in that particular site, and what the lighting will be like. Look for a suitable individual flower or a grouping of flowers, and then consider the lighting specific to the ones that you've chosen. Will it be frontal lighting or side lighting or back lighting? And what perspective you'll take the photo from. Are you going to be down at ground level with a flower? Are you going to be above it? Or in the case of a flower that we have here on the peninsula called nodding trillium, typically it's taken from below the flower. And how you want to frame the flower. One of the things that I work on is looking around the entire frame through the viewfinder to see exactly what's in there, what I want to be in there, what I don't want to be in there. And to try to take the photograph as close to what the finished product will be like as possible. But there are some exceptions to that as well. I'm not going to take the time. There's a link here to a depth of field simulator that's really quite neat. You plug in the camera that you're using, the lens that you're using, the subject, the distance you are away, and it shows you a calculation of how much will be in focus in front of the subject and how much behind. So it's really quite a neat exercise to go through. And there's lots of those on the internet as well. In terms of camera features, our cameras are loaded with things, and probably things that some of us may never end up accessing. But in terms of exposure modes, auto exposure is the camera making all of the decisions for you, and you can't override any of them. So if the camera wants to use flash, you can't make it not use flash. So it's the least versatile of the modes. Program mode is often referred to as programmable auto or programmed auto. So again, the camera is making all of the decisions, but you can override them. So you can change the aperture shutter speed combination. You can add flash if you wanted, or don't use flash. So much more versatile. But getting into these other programs like aperture priority and shutter priority, really, I think are a desirable way to go. Aperture priority, you choose the aperture that you want to shoot at, and the camera will choose the corresponding shutter speed to produce correct exposure. Shutter priority is just the opposite. You choose the shutter speed, it chooses the corresponding aperture to go with it. Manual, you're setting both of those. When I'm shooting things like the moon, I usually start out setting manually an f-stop that I want, like f8, and then I'll try a shutter speed, and it'll probably be overexposed to start with, and I'll keep working my way down till I get one that gives me a good exposure. A lot of cameras have scene modes, so there'd be one for beach and snow and, you know, evening and backlighting and all of those sorts of things. And all it is the camera making those decisions for you. But as you learn how those work and see the results of them, then you can learn to do that manually and not have to rely on the scene modes. But they're there on some cameras to take advantage of. In terms of metering, the camera's light metering. In Nikon terms, one is called matrix, and in Canon it's evaluative. And here the light meter is reading thousands of points from around the screen. And it's averaging them out to give what it thinks is a correct exposure. Center weighted is getting most of the information from the center of the screen. And in some cameras, you can determine how large that circle will be, 6 millimeters, 8 millimeters. And if you're good at doing that, then you might want to change it from time to time, depending on your subject. I use aperture priority almost exclusively, and I use center weighted metering almost exclusively. Spot metering is taking a light reading off a very specific spot that could be used for shooting the moon as well, or for something else. Image size is one thing. Whatever your sensor size is, let's say you've got a 20 megapixel sensor, you don't have to shoot at 20 megapixels. You can reduce that to create a smaller image, although you're not using all of the size and capability that the camera has built into it. Image quality, if you're shooting JPEGs, a JPEG is a compressed image. So you've just taken a photograph using a, really incredible piece of technology, and as soon as the image is compressed, it's throwing out some of that information. But you can adjust the amount of compression, so you can have what's called a fine image, and it will have the least amount of compression, or go on down the line until you have much higher compression, but you'll have lower image quality. So I think for the most part, people want to be shooting the best quality that they can. TIFF is an uncompressed format, but it does result in a very large file size. And RAW is a format that's sometimes described as a digital image. So it's really just a numeric file. And you need something called a RAW converter that will produce a thumbnail image for you to work with. RAWs give you a lot of latitude in terms of your processing of the image afterwards. So I think more people are using that now. Your camera probably has a number of focus points to it. My D200 had 9 points, and I could move those points around the screen. Otherwise, the focus point is typically in the middle of the screen. And what you end up doing is looking through your viewfinder, moving the viewfinder to use that focus point to focus on what you want to be the main part of the subject, and then moving back to reframe. When in fact, you can move that point all around the screen to do that. And we'll see some examples of that shortly. My D300 had 51 focus points, and my D500 now has 153 points. So I can move those virtually around the screen without having to move the camera or my eye. You'll probably have some buttons that are external on the camera so that you can do things like exposure lock and focus lock, or use something like button focus. So look those up in your menus. Some cameras have a depth of field preview button. What that does when you press it is physically stops down the iris to the aperture that you've set, and you get an idea of what will be in focus and what will not. If you're using an electronic viewfinder or a mirrorless camera, then you'll have a visual of that. You won't have to worry about using a depth of field preview button. Some of your buttons you can assign functions to. So I have one, for example, that I've assigned to bracketing so that I don't have to go into the menu and look that up every time. So look for those on your camera body. I haven't typically been a monitor user. I put my eye to the viewfinder and do my framing and photographing that way. My newest camera does have an articulating viewfinder on the back, so that makes it a little easier to do things like flowers and so on. So that's something you can take advantage of. Most cameras have a built-in flash. Sometimes they can be harsh, so you can add a diffuser to it or put a Kleenex tissue over it, or get something like the Gary Fong light spheres. It's like a lampshade that you put on your flash to take the harshness out of it. Auto ISO is another feature that some people use. If you know that you have certain settings that you want to use for every shot, maybe you want 1/1000th of a second and f5.6. As the light changes, that combination of settings will change as well. But if you use Auto ISO, those two settings, your shutter speed and your aperture, will remain the same, and it's the ISO that will change to compensate for that. And you can put a limit on how far you're willing to let the camera go with that. Exposure compensation is another very useful thing to do. You can use that instead of bracketing. Often some colors are very reflective, and you end up overexposing or perhaps underexposing your shot. So you can use your exposure compensation button to alter that. Just remember to put it back to 0 or neutral when you're done, because your next picture will be taken with the same thing. And bracketing is something where you take several shots in a row. You determine how many shots you want and what exposure interval you want to do. So in this case, I've set it to take 5 shots in a row. So I'm gonna have to press the shutter 5 times. First shot will be 2/3 of a stop underexposed, the next 1/3 under, then at what the camera would meter the shot at, 1/3 of a stop over and 2/3 of a stop over. So you can change those increments to whatever you want, and the number of shots that you take to whatever you want. And then once you've learned how your camera works, you probably don't need to use that as much. An exposure compensation button will serve your purposes. But if you're doing things like HDR photos, then you're going to do this, take several photos and then sandwich them together in your software to get the advantage of all of those spots. In terms of cameras, people sometimes ask, well, what's the best camera to have? And probably the best camera is the one that you happen to have with you on that day. And that might be your phone, and there are lots of great apps for using your phone. It might be a point and shoot camera. Most of them have a macro setting, and that might be shown by a flower or a microscope. Or you might be using a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. So here you're going to decide, if you're buying a new camera, do I want an FX or full frame camera? Do I want an APS-C sensor? A micro Four Thirds, which Olympus and Panasonic do. So do a bit of research on those. If I was only shooting insects and wildflowers, I would probably go full frame. A 24 megapixel sensor in a full frame is going to have larger photo sites than the others will, and they can gather more information, more light information, and overall is better. But because I shoot birds and things as well, by using the smaller sensor, you get a crop factor. So a 300 millimeter lens on a full frame camera is going to be 300 millimeters. On a crop sensor, on an APS-C sensor, it's going to be one and a half times that. So all of a sudden my 300 becomes or behaves like a 450 millimeter. And in 4/3, it's going to double your focal length. So that 300 behaves like a 600 millimeter. You can shoot wildflowers or macros with a standard lens, with a kit lens, with a telephoto or a zoom lens. You can add close-up rings to those, which are little screw-on filters, like little magnifying glasses. They usually come in a set of 3, and you can use one or use them in combination to increase the magnification. A reversing ring is something that attaches to your lens filter threads as well, and allows you to attach your lens backwards onto the camera body. And it's like looking through the wrong end of a pair of binoculars. It behaves like a microscope. Or using a dedicated macro lens. And a true macro lens will give you 1-to-1 reproduction. So life-size object on the sensor. And that's certainly great for doing the kinds of things that we do with wildflowers and insects. Nikon has three macro lenses, a 60 millimeter, an 85, and a 105. The wider the field of view, as in the 60, though, the closer you have to be to the subject to get your one-to-one reproduction. And sometimes you're so close that you're actually shading it with your body or with your camera. The longer, the 105, which is the one I use, gives you a little more working room, and it's a beautiful lens. It's a superb piece of optics. You can also use extension tubes, which are just hollow tubes that go between the lens and the camera body, and they will increase your magnification. Again, you can use them singly or in combination with each other. And a polarizing filter can be a good thing to use in wildflower photography. It takes away some glare of light at certain planes, and also does some color saturation for you. And it's something that's very difficult to duplicate in software. So having that screwed onto your camera can be good. Lens hood is always good to use. It keeps out stray light. Tripod is a great thing to use. I have a little one actually right here, and you'll see a picture in a moment. This supports my DSLR camera body and a 300 millimeter lens, and takes up a whole lot. It's a much smaller footprint than using my full-size tripod. So that's a very good one. Some cameras have infrared capability, or an infrared cable release, remote shutter release. Mine does not, so I have to use a physical cable screwed into the camera body. But that means that you can often reduce the shake that comes with taking a picture. Most cameras have an onboard flash that you can use, and you can add macro flashes as well. Make sure you have extra batteries for your camera and your flash, and extra memory cards as well. So I'm going to skip out of this and get into some photos. And here we go. Do we have my card up there?
Yeah, yes. I think so.
Great, thank you. So this is me. I put in the chat my my email address, my website, and my Twitter handle. One of the things I love about Twitter is following other photographers and the work that they do. I have an Instagram account. I don't use it very much, but it's something I should probably look into a little bit more. I'm going to go full frame here, and I hope that's worked. So again, you know, the best camera is the one that you have with you. If you don't have camera at all, then you're not going to be taking an image, and that might be your phone or a point and shoot or your full gear. This is my D500 body with a 300 millimeter f4 on it, and you can see that that little tripod supports that weight. So it's a really useful item. I've only just recently, 6 or 8 weeks ago, I've replaced that lens with the newest version of it from Nikon, and it has a PF lens element in it, which allows the lens to be made about half the length and half the weight, which for me makes it far more portable, which is really great. So I'm enjoying using that now. The other bread and butter for me is the 105 macro lens, which is, as I say, is just a superb piece of glass. I have a macro flash. I have Nikon's twin flash. You can put as many as 6 flashes around this circle. I don't use it very often, and that's partly because I'm not very skilled at using flash. The whole idea behind flash is to have it not look like flash was used. And I find that even with these diffusers, I can dial down the flash intensity, but I sometimes put a tissue over these as well to further diffuse the light. The neat thing about these, though, is that they don't have to be used attached to the camera. I often will put one underneath a flower and hand hold the other one in another position.
Peter, sorry to interrupt. I just want to check. What are we supposed to be looking at right now?
Should be a look at a picture of my camera with a flash on the front.
Okay, so we're just looking at like your, what's it called? Business card type thing.
So it hasn't moved on.
There we go. I think we're now at a camera with the flashes on it.
Okay. Now, if I do take this up to fill the frame, do we get to the next picture, or is it still on the camera?
Okay, so I think so. Stop sharing your screen. Make sure that it's already full screen, and then when you choose the option, try to make sure to choose the one that is already full screen. So like stop sharing for a second, and then make sure whatever you want to look at is already full screen,
Okay.
and then try and choose that one as your screen.
Okay. So that might be a little difficult. So I think what I might have to do is work in here with a smaller size image. What are you seeing now, Zach?
You're not sharing your screen right now, so nothing.
Okay, all right. And now?
Someone laying on a boardwalk with a camera.
Okay. And if I go one more frame, are you seeing a bee now?
Yeah, we're good.
So we'll do this. I just won't be able to fill the whole frame with the image, but this is my friend David, and this is down at Petrel Point Nature Reserve, Ontario Nature Reserve. This is a place where there are boardwalks, and they're there to protect the flowers. And yet, when you go to places like this, you still see where people have stepped off the boardwalk to try to get that great shot of a flower. So you do the best you can with what you have. David's shooting grass pink here, I think. And there's so much in there, it's often difficult to isolate a flower. The nice thing about macro is the detail that you get. I'm hoping you'll be able to see this as well. The original image for this one was this. And I knew that from where I was, I couldn't get the framing that I want. So I took a picture that I thought I would be able to crop later, and I did. The other thing is with my focus points, you can see that I wanted the lip of the flower to be the main focus point. And so I moved the focus point to there rather than using the center one, pointing that at the tongue, locking the focus, and then moving back to reframe. So being able to move that point around the screen can be a really helpful thing. So I hope you were able to see that.
Yes, we were.
All right. Here's another one. The previous one was shot at f8 to get as much depth of field as I could. You can still see some elements in the background, but mostly out of focus. The next one I used f16 for. This was a different flower, and there was a greater distance between it and whatever else was in the background. So not too much else showed up, but there's still a couple of distracting grass blades in there that people may or may not be happy having in their photo. This is my friend Jim. Jim's got his camera on a tripod. He's got a cable release. He's got a diffuser. He's got the whole thing going here. Jim also uses on the back of his camera, I think it's called a Hoodman, or there might be a different name for it. So now he's using his electronic viewfinder, but having a much more magnified view of it, which is kind of a cool thing to have. This is my daughter's friend, Ashley, and Parks Canada staff would know Ashley as a former Bruce Peninsula National Park staff person. We went out one day, and Ashley's using a tripod. She's using a zoom telephoto, focusing with the monitor on the back, and doing everything right. And the flower that she's taking a picture of is the purple fringed orchid. And with the zoom telephoto, her minimum focus distance is quite a bit further back from the subject. So she's back on the trail and taking that picture. And this is one that I took with the 105 macro of that same flower on that day at f8. This is one from just this week at Singing Sands. This lesser purple fringed orchids are everywhere. There are a couple of right beside the trail that are accessible for photographing, or with a long lens, you could pick up some of them that are out in the wetlands. This is a picture of a monarch butterfly, obviously. You can see that there's quite a bit of detail in this photo, but this was taken with my 300mm f4 from about 6 feet back. So a telephoto can still be a very good tool for doing smaller objects. So don't hesitate to do that if you don't have a macro lens. This is a Baltimore checker spot, and the flower that it's on is poison hemlock. This is on the property in Cambridge where I work for the school board in outdoor education. In Waterloo region, the checker spot is a rare butterfly listed as rare. Its host plant is turtle heads. And on the property that I worked on, we had turtle heads, and so we had checker spots. And this is mostly in focus, but you can see the trailing edge of the hind wing is not. There's a lens called a tilt shift lens, and it's got kind of an accordion in between the lens and the camera body so that you can twist and contort it and put things that aren't in focus. So that's kind of a neat thing. I don't own one of those, and I'm not sure that I want one. But this picture too, I love the detail in this, and looking at the scales on the wings and looking at the eye and the proboscis. The checker spot belongs to the brushfoot butterfly family, as does the monarch. So all you're seeing there is 4 legs, and insects are 6-legged, and the 2 front legs are quite reduced in size and usually held up underneath the head, but you can see the proboscis probing the flower for nectar there. Here's one, and again, you know, the perspective that you choose to shoot at is up to you. This one is just a flat from above shot, but with the daisies, you get sort of a cascading view and increasing out of focus, blurred background as you go down. And this is a northern, sorry, I've lost it there for a second, northern crescent. This is a ribbon snake, and you can see from the scale in front of the eye is one of the identifiers for ribbon snake, and usually a band that's a orangey red or brown as well that garter snakes don't typically have. This was taken with my Olympus Tough point and shoot camera, a little waterproof camera. We were kayaking one day and came across this, and so the goal wasn't to have a frameable photo, it was just to have a picture to take home to identify it from, and it turns out that this is the larva of a smeared dagger moth, but it is quite a beautiful caterpillar and would have been worth trying to get a better picture of. This was taken with another Panasonic point and shoot camera, but the idea was to have a better quality picture, so a little more time taken in composure and settings and so on. This one holds up pretty well to zooming in terms of detail, so this is just a point and shoot pocket camera, but you can see it does a pretty good job of macro work. This is a black swallowtail caterpillar, and this was shot with the Olympus point and shoot as well. The problem with this one is when you do try to zoom it up, you lose a lot of detail. So it's not bad as just a snapshot camera, but not so great if you want to crop it and do that sort of thing with it, where this one is taken with the DSLR and the 105 macro, and you can see that at 100%, you've still got a lot of detail in there that you can work with, either for printing enlargements or for further cropping it. So that's that photo as taken, that's not cropped. Cardinal flower is what Jim and I were photographing that day, and I'm not sure that I got very spectacular photos. I was having trouble and I wasn't really focused on what I was doing, but there were dragonflies and damselflies all around us. So I kind of switched to that. So some days you go out with a plan and you get what you want, and other days you kind of switch the plan as you go. So this is an emerald spreadwing. This is a beautiful damselfly. And often when I'm looking for these kinds of things in butterflies and wildflowers, I'm looking for one that will have some distance between where it is and the background. And that helps with, so this is shot at f8, but still you've got a totally blurred background. And you can see some of the detail in there in this damselfly. So I had more fun doing those that day than cardinal flower. This is an ebony jewel wing. This damselfly is flying at Singing Sands right now. I was down there this week. It's got a beautiful iridescent blue-green body. And this was just kind of a neat perspective. It just landed in front of me. And often with dragonflies and damselflies, if you disturb them and they take off, they'll often come down and land on the same perch that they were on. So if you're patient and wait for them, then you're maybe going to get a good shot and you've got all your settings dialed in. This one I did crop a little bit when I took it. I was guilty of using the center focus point. So there's a lot of empty space on the left-hand side. And so I just cropped it to take some of that out and make it a little more interesting. I think that's all that I want to do there. And I'm going to switch to another set of photos that I hope to get through quickly before our time runs out. And I'm hoping you're seeing my screen there again with my card.
Yep, the one with the card.
Okay, and this is one of my favorite photos, and it may be not the best technical photo, but often sometimes you take a photo and where you took it, when you took it, who you were with, something about that event is special about it. And so this one I've used on my business card. I've used it in one of the greeting cards that I make. There's a framed version of it behind me on the wall right here at the cottage. So it's just one of my favorite photos. These are some of the ones that people come to Orchid Fest in June for. Yellow lady slipper, as you heard from earlier speakers, is very ubiquitous on the Bruce. We had 51 of them growing at the end of our driveway this year, so they're everywhere, but they're still a beautiful flower. And I take pictures of them every year. I don't assume that I've already taken my best yellow lady slipper photo, so I keep going back for more. Showy lady slipper, ram's head, and of course the Calypso orchid. This is a showy lady slipper taken at f8, but I took it at 8:20 at night. The yellow is very reflective and you often get a hot spot. So I was trying to reduce that by taking it later at night, but I don't think I've taken anywhere it isn't there at all. The next one was taken at f11, so you get a little more depth of field, but it also brings up some of that background that I find very distracting. So here's one that I took at f3 that should have very little depth of field, but because it's taken from further back, you get a greater amount of depth in front of the subject and behind. So that would have been my favorite photo of that day. And sometimes the perspective that you take, again, this is not a great photo, but looking at this, I see that that's actually a pretty cool looking flower from behind. So I'll probably want to go out one day and try taking some more of those. After a rain is a great time to be taking pictures. But please don't spritz flowers. When you do in the heat of the day, each of those drops becomes a magnifying glass and can burn the flowers. You might only have one day to go out shooting and you go out and you find that that flower is just not in bloom that day. But here's one of a yellow lady slipper with the bud just opening up. And then over time, you end up having a whole collection through the development of that flower. This is at the end of our driveway as well. I like the angles on the stems. These are flowers that are reaching out to the road in the open space and the light. It's called phototropism. And it had the rain. So I just thought it was a visually kind of a neat thing. And this is one that I took in Cambridge on the site that I worked at. This, by the way, if you look at these lady slippers and you look at these lady slippers, you can see that the petals on these ones are a more purpley color. This is actually a subspecies called the small yellow lady slipper. And that one was just a snapshot of, I wasn't trying to create art or doing anything else. I was just trying to record what I saw that day. But you see flowers in various stages of development and the stream going by. And so that's what that was all about. However, in the top left of that screen, you see a single lady slipper. And I did take an individual photo of that one. I don't often do groupings just because I'm not that good at it. This grouping, though, was at the parking area of the Bruce Alvar site of just off Highway 6 near the Dyers Bay Road. And I like that. In fact, I use it for my homepage photo on my website. I used it for the cover photo of one of my books. I know that's a terrible photo of the photo, but there's the book there. It looks a little better in that one. So that was a grouping where the flowers are facing in different directions and different things in focus and out of focus. So one of my favorites. Showy lady slippers are famous for having 2 flower buds on each stem. Yellow lady slippers less so a bit of a rarity. This one was on the Shoaldice Lake Road, just off the Dyers Bay Road. And even in their final stages, this can be a very beautiful flower because now you know it's going to seed, and we have that record of everything from the bud just opening to to the flower finishing. This is a ram's head lady's orchid in its first stages coming up. And here it is coming out of the petals and sepals. And then we've got the full flower. And when I look at this, I kind of think of a caterpillar becoming a butterfly. You know, we started out with this, and inside that, there's the genetics to produce this, and that's pretty awesome. And this is a beautiful flower. One of the things about this, it's not a very big flower. So you see a photo of it and it takes up the whole screen, but I'm gonna get rid of that. But in real life, it's actually quite small. They're very dainty looking flowers. And often what I'm trying to do is get a nice picture of the flowering part of it. But I really wanted this day some of the full plant with the leaves. And this one was off the trail a little bit, and I used my 70 to 200 2.8 to zoom in and get that photo. This was also taken at a full stop, underexposed. It was a foggy day, and fog can disperse the light and make it too bright for your photos. So I like the look of that one. There's one of the flower part cropped up. This is a flower that as it ages, that top leaf gets really tall. And so sometimes it will extend out of your frame. And so I do try to get ram's heads in their earlier days of development so that that flower is not too tall. And I'm more prone to landscape format when I'm taking pictures, but ones like this certainly lend themselves to portrait mode. And this is one I took just this year. And what I really liked about this one was the veining in the back part of the kind of the chin part of the ram here. I just like that color and the texture. Showy lady slippers are beautiful flowers. These are big flowers. These are ones that can go to almost a meter tall. But also when you look at the lady slippers, the flower part is actually a petal of the flower. There's 3 petals and 3 sepals. So it's specially adapted to hold the flowering parts, the reproductive parts of the flower. So in this case, you can see what a bee would see or a fly would see. It's got a great big arrow pointing down saying, come on in here. The flower actually produces a very sweet, attractive smell. But when the bee gets inside, there's actually no nectar. So this is what's called a deceptive flower. So it's producing something to attract pollinating insects, but it doesn't give anything back in return. So it's really good at advertising, but not so much on the follow through. Once the insect is in there, it's difficult for it to get back out that hole because the lip is recurved on the inside and there's little hairs that make it hard to climb back out. But the insect sees a light at the back. There's a back door for it to go up and out. While it's inside, it drops off any pollen that it's carrying from a previous flower, and then it picks up pollen from this one to carry out. And in the case of the lady slippers, it's not just pollen grains that are on the stamens. They're actually big lumps of pollen called a pollinia, and there's 2 in each flower. So the insect is going to pick up that whole wad of pollen and take it with it. So it seems like a risky strategy for the flower to give up all that pollen, and maybe that insect isn't going to make it to another flower to cross-pollinate it, but obviously they've been successful at it. So here's one just emerging. I'm starting to go a little quicker now because I know we're running out of time. Here's our 2 flower buds on one stem. At this particular spot, it's in the forest, but there's bright sunlight coming through the canopy. So this one was underexposed by 2/3 of a stop. And the black background just comes from the shading from the shadows in the forest. It's a spectacular spot. It's one that I'm really reluctant to share with anybody else anymore because this great big field of lady slippers has now been fragmented by people stepping off the boardwalk and walking among the flowers. And when you compact the soil around them, it disturbs the relationship between the plant's roots and mycorrhizal fungi that are in the soil, and we'll maybe never get flowers growing there again. So that's been a really disappointing thing to see that occur over the last couple of years. But it's even at the way it is now, it just takes your breath away to turn the corner and see all these beautiful flowers. This is probably my favorite from that spot, just with the lighting that was there that day. This is a pink lady slipper moccasin flower on an Orchidfest hike a couple of years ago. I was led to this spot. The plants weren't growing at all on that day, and I went back on 2 subsequent trips. It was about 2 kilometers back in the bush, and on the second one, I did find them flowering So this is a very different looking lady slipper. And when you look at the pouch on this one, the cleft is really deep and the opening is very narrow. So this is going to be a different kind of pollinator that's going to do the job for this one than it is for the other lady slippers. This year I went in with some friends, but I didn't take my camera gear with me. All I had was my phone, but you can see you can still get a reasonable photo. Some calypsos, which are, a bucket list kind of flower for some people. The majority of them, I understand, grow on Flower Pot Island. This also is a tiny, tiny flower. So if you are out looking for them, you want to be very careful where you step, because it would be entirely possible to step on them without even seeing that they were there. Come in both pink and white. And these are ladies' tresses. I think this is nodding ladies' tress, and they grow in a spiral around the stem. And the ones at the bottom are the first ones to flower, and they work their way up. So this is kind of a neat and challenging one to photograph. I think this is hooded ladies' tress. In this one, I'm looking through the viewfinder and I saw some legs, and I knew the flower didn't have legs, so I assumed there was a crab spider on the other side, and sure enough, there it was. So you can see it sitting, waiting at the entrance to the flower to grab a pollinator that's coming in. So sometimes you go out with one goal in mind and you end up with something else as well. And because these are such neat spiders, I put in a couple of other crab spider photos. This is the goldenrod crab spider, and it can change color throughout the season. Here it is on bladder campion, and a little more challenging to find on there as well. Lakeside daisy, again, groupings are not my forte, but there was some neat collections there. And not a particularly showy flower, but if you listen to the Alvar talks and you realize that they grow in so few places in the world, and that we have 90 or 95% of them, I think we heard in Ontario, they are pretty special, and again, a spectacular sight to see when you walk in on that trail at the Bruce Alvar. Some fringed polygala or polygala. Dwarf lake iris, I've never been very successful at photographing. They're so close to the ground, so that's a challenge that remains for me. And I think I'll probably quit there because I'm looking at the clock and I don't know if there are questions or will be questions. So I'm going to, I guess, stop sharing and see, Zach, if we do.
Yes, thanks for the presentation. Just too many good photos you have there to go through. So far, we don't have any questions in there. So if anyone has some, we have time for a few questions. So put them in the Q&A part.
Okay. I have a handout that I've used at Orchid Fests in the past, and I put my email in the chat. So if anybody wants a copy of that handout, email me and I will send you a copy of it.
And just re-puts your contact info in the chat again.
Yeah, right up there at the top.
So there's a question in chat. So is it overcast or full sun ideal for photography?
It's probably different under different circumstances, but I would prefer overcast often to bright sun. Certainly on those showy lady slippers, bright sun is what made that picture, but it can also produce a lot of shadows depending on the time of day that you shoot. So I often prefer overcast days to bright sun.
And just, I think a question is asking, can you buy or do you have books on orchids, or do you have a book on orchids that they can buy?
I don't know. The book that I held up are just books that I made for self, as you would on a holiday or something. I made them through Apple, so I have a couple of those for myself. I did have a question for other people though, and I'm still looking for a better flower guide for asters. I have the goldenrods and asters that the Owen Sound field naturalist puts out, but other field guides are a little skimpy on that. So if anybody knows a good field guide for asters, I'd love to know about that.
So if people want to see more of your photos, your website would probably be the best place to find them?
Yes, so I've got butterflies and birds and dragonflies and damselflies and all sorts of things. So for sure, my website would be the spot.
give it another minute in case there's any more questions.
Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry for my technical difficulties at the start, but thank you for getting me out of that.
Oh, it's not a problem. Still got through the presentation.
So I think, and you know, sometimes people, actually, my sister just sent me a picture tonight of a bee and a flower, and I thought it was a pretty good picture. And I said, you know, if you crop that up a bit, we'd see more of the flower and the bee. And she did that. And so she was more pleased with the picture after that. But it really doesn't matter what somebody else thinks. If you've taken a picture and you like it, that's all that matters. It's a good photo. Photographers often talk about creating an image as opposed to taking a photo as well.
Oh, is there one more? During non-pandemic times, do you lead hikes for or like on photographing orchids?
I don't. I've only done it at the Orchid Fest, and I've done it because I was invited to do it, but I wouldn't typically present myself as an expert in photography. I have done bird hikes and things like that, but not so much photography. I do enjoy going out with other friends to take pictures, but you know, everybody does their own thing.
So maybe people can keep a lookout for orchid festivals and further years we can get back to doing stuff in person.
It'll be great when we can do that. And certainly a lot of what I've learned has been at previous festivals, and being in the visitor center theater with, you know, that huge projector and beautiful screen is a great way to see people's presentations as well.
It looks like we are out of questions. So thanks for the presentation. A lot of good information. And of course, so many great photos in there. It's just hard to keep track of how many you have. And that's only just orchids that you were showing us. So thanks for your presentation.